Good afternoon. Back in March, we were planning to have a delegation from the UK go over to Frankfurt in Germany to visit the ELISA eHighway project, electric roads project. And unfortunately, that trip was cancelled right at the start of the coronavirus lockdown. So we weren't able to have that trip. Instead of that, what we are doing today, we've realized that it's pretty unlikely that we'll be able to hold that tour. So instead of that, we have decided to hold a virtual tour today. We've got a program which includes all of the same presentations that we were going to have on our trip in March. During that trip, we were going to fly into Frankfurt Airport to have a series of presentations at the offices of Hessen Mobile, who run the site, the ELISA eHighway site. And then we were going to go out in a bus and to visit the site. So today we're going to have exactly the same set of presentations that we we're going to have then. Instead of having, let me get the agenda up. So we're going to have three presentations at the start. My little introduction, these three presentations, putting the scenery tracking into context. We're going to have Krista Toren from Scania, who's going to talk about the truck side of the catenary trucking project, and Dr. Royswig from Hessen Mobile, who's going to talk about lessons learned from the field trial. And the first presentation will be by Julius Urens. Then we're going to have a bit of a break. We'll have a question and answer, which Justin Moss from Siemens in the UK is going to host. We're going to have a bit of a break. Then we're going to have what was going to be a visit to the site in a bus. We will have some videos made recently by some of the people on the ground, including Siemens, and they'll show us around the site. So unfortunately, we're not going to be able to actually visit, but we'll see a recent visit. That'll be followed by a bit of a question and answer. Then we're going to have another break. Then Professor Boltz from Technical University of Darmstadt is going to talk about the role of eHighways of field testing on the way to large-scale implementation. And then I'm going to finish off by talking about our proposed electrification pilot project that we are proposing for the UK. So that's the agenda. I've just got a few slides to kick things off and put a few things into context. So let me just do that. So here's a bit of background. Throughout Europe and in the UK, we're trying to get to net zero carbon emissions by 2045 or 2050. The amount of freight traveling around is increasing, and that means that the carbon emissions from the transport, and particularly freight transport share sector, is increasing. In fact, the International Transport Forum is predicting a threefold increase in emissions from road freight if something serious is not done by 2050. So that's in the business as usual scenario. And yes, lorries are particularly difficult to decarbonize, and that's why their emissions are expected to go up. You can see on this little graph the various sectors, including the power sector and energy industries, which are reducing their carbon emissions, but transport, which has gone up since 1990 and continues to go up actually now. This graph is just an attempt to paint a picture across the landscape of possible things that can be done to reduce heavy vehicle fuel consumption and emissions. What I'm plotting here is on the vertical axis is the percentage reduction in greenhouse gas emissions that are possible for a truck using some sort of different technology. And along the horizontal axis, the x-axis, what I call barriers to mainstream adoption. Now, if the technology has low barriers to mainstream adoption, then many different vehicle fleet operators can adopt that technology easily, and then it can make a big difference. If the barriers to mainstream adoption are high, that means it's difficult to be adopted in the mainstream. That technology is unlikely to have a major effect on greenhouse gas emissions. So we're looking for technologies which have a big reduction in greenhouse gases and low barriers to mainstream adoption. And the best solutions are in the top right-hand corner of this graph. So there's a bunch of technologies in the bottom right-hand corner, which are things, are kind of low-hanging fruit. Things like improving the aerodynamics, light weighting, low rolling resistance tires. These technologies all have sub 10% reduction in greenhouse gases, but they have low barriers to adoption. In fact, we're adopting them all already. All of these things are being done at the moment. There's lots of other things you can do. You can train drivers to drive better, eco-driving. You can improve the roughness of roads, make them smoother, and that has a small effect on greenhouse gas emissions due to lower rolling resistance. But actually, there's pretty high barriers to that. It's a very expensive thing to do. Obviously not one of the things that we would do to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Tire pressure control is important. There's all kinds of things you can do, and I can plot bubbles all across this graph. There's some in the middle, gas vehicles, liquid natural gas and compressed natural gas. An important one here is electrification of urban delivery vehicles in 2025. So this is around about 2025. There's an increasing drive to electrifying urban delivery vehicles. And by 2025, that will give us about 20% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions, which is good. By 2035, because the electricity grid is getting greener, it's decarbonizing, becoming decarbonized, electricity is becoming greener, and so the benefit of that electrification of urban delivery vehicles will go up. But it takes time to get to 2035, which is why the barriers increase, and so on. Hydrogen is down here in 2035. It's significantly worse than electrification. Exhaust heat recovery is a technology which provides less than 10% reduction in greenhouse gases and is expensive and difficult to implement. Autonomous vehicles. Autonomous vehicles are interesting from the point of view of cost, but less obviously beneficial in terms of carbon emissions. High capacity vehicles, on the other hand, do significantly reduce greenhouse gas emissions because they reduce fuel consumption. Using vehicles at higher capacity reduces fuel consumption and improves efficiency. Biogas is over here. Biogas gives about 70% reduction in emissions. The big problem with biogas, or the big question about it, is whether there is enough of it available to go around. And that's why it's at the very high barriers end. Electrification of long-haul freight, which is what we're going to talk about today, has the potential to reduce greenhouse gases by up to 90% by 2040. There are barriers to electrification of the long haul, but we think that they are reducible barriers that we're going to talk about today. We don't think there's sufficient benefit to tackle the things in the bottom left-hand corner. The barriers are too high and the benefits are too low. The things that we think that should be tackled are the ones in this green area. On the right, there's lots that can be done to improve the impact of the various interventions down there. We can improve the effect of aerodynamics or low rolling resistance tires or driver training. And the ones on the left are things where we need to reduce the barriers. We need to reduce the perceived technical, economic, and political barriers to implementation of those technologies. What we're going to talk about today is electrification of the long haul. And that is something where we think if there's any silver bullet in decarbonisation of road freight, it is electrification of the long haul. So in the Centre for Sustainable Road Freight, we've done some modelling of carbon emissions as a function of time. We've concluded that if everything that can be done is done by the road freight sector, we can expect about 30 to 40% reduction in carbon emissions by 2050. The only way that we can get to more than 40%, to that 90% that we need, or even 100%, is to electrify the long haul. That's the one thing which will take us to where we need to go. So that's the end of my introduction. Now I'd like to hand over to Julius Urens, who's going to talk about catenary trucking on the way to freight decarbonisation. Over to you, Julius.